Anyhow, we're going to go over now and speak with a person who could answer more than any other scientist I know in the United States about what is happening in Africa, and a person who's been there many times, Professor Charles Geshekter. Professor Geshekter is a 3-time Fulbright Scholar, a Professor Emeritus of African History at California State University at Chico, California. He has served as an advisor to the U.S. Senate, the U.S. State Department, and several African governments, and he has also researched the condition of AIDS and HIV extensively in Africa. He joins us now on our phone. Nice to have you with us today.
It's good to be with you, Gary. You're catching me at an appropriate moment, I guess. I'm in line waiting to get some prescription drugs, and so although they're not HIV or AIDS drugs, I'm in a pharmacy, and through the miracle of cell phones, I could be on your program. And I got to tell you, you deserve a prize for what you were able to accomplish with Gallo and Montagnier, and I think they demonstrated by their behavior better than anything that David Crow or myself or anyone else could say. I think they demonstrated for you and your listeners that they have a lot of things to be afraid of. And if I were them, faced with you, I'd probably hang up too. So I think they did what was probably very predictable and yet very, very ratifying and validating for exactly what a number of us have been saying for so long. So if you want to talk about AIDS in Africa, I suppose I'm your guy.
You are the man, because you have had the on-ground experience. I'm going to let you speak uninterrupted, and if you would, explain the difference between what you and others on the ground have seen about AIDS in Africa, the diagnosing, the treating, the massive funds from the Gates Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, Drugs for Everyone, the politics of it, and take us through the reality of it.
Oh, that's a tall order, Gary. That's a tall order. But as a historian, I will try to be brief and concise. I've certainly been to various parts of Africa over 20 times in the last 35 years, and I've certainly spent some time in the field in South Africa and Somalia and Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. And what I can tell you is that over the last 25 years, wherever I've gone, I've seen evidence, I've observed the data, if you will, with my own eyes and listening to what people tell me, of the decline in the quality of life in all of those parts of Africa. And what I mean by that is there's increased examples of malnutrition, of tuberculosis, of untreated malaria, of bacterial infections, the breakdown of social services, of public health facilities, and so forth. And I'd say over the last 25 years or so, the overall health condition of Africans can be shown to have deteriorated. It has absolutely nothing to do with HIV or HIV prevalence or HIV rates. It has everything to do with political economy, civil war, strife of that sort, and the bankruptcy of many of the governments. But as a World Bank report pointed out just a couple of weeks ago, at the end of April, the diversion of so much money over to AIDS programs, nearly all of which have been shown to be failures and not to have achieved the effects that they were promised, has meant that a lot of money has been diverted from things that can be treated, like tuberculosis, malaria, bacterial infections, malnutrition perhaps as well. And I think that people like Gallo and Montagnier have a lot to answer for in terms of the absolute bankruptcy and repeated failures of the programs that they have staked their reputation on. And I wouldn't want to be asked why that's the case, but I think the people that you are having on your program here today could explain to you very carefully why that's the case. And I certainly know that that I could too. This mania, this obsession, this hysteria about condomizing Africa and getting Africans to change their behavior patterns hasn't worked. And I think it was Einstein who said that insanity is when you do the same thing over and over again and expect to get different results. It's not going to happen. And so it really is time, and you are to be praised again. It's time right now on these various anniversaries, 25 years of HIV, to take a cold, fresh, new look at the data and come up with a new explanation as to what is really going on in Africa, California, the world when it comes to this issue of AIDS.
Would you take us through some of the discrepancies? They've told us that we have this epidemic of people in South Africa, and yet you've been there and you see what you have an epidemic of. Could you explain how the different classes of people, including the blacks, how the relationship of AIDS is defined by poverty that has not been addressed, and the old apartheid ghettos are still there. They haven't been. Because there's apartheid no longer there doesn't mean the apartheid living conditions have changed a great deal as far as the malnutrition and diseases, tuberculosis, malaria. Could you take us through that, please?
Sure. Again, when talking about any African country, in this case we'll talk about South Africa, but when talking about any country in Africa, it's crucial that listeners understand that Gallo and Montagnier kind of blur the distinction routinely between the results of a so-called HIV antibody test, which is one thing, which is a lab test done on serum, on blood, versus an actual AIDS case in Africa, which is defined not by a test result, but by clinical symptoms. And if you understand, as I know you do, of course, but others need to, that the clinical symptoms that define a case of quote-unquote AIDS in Africa involve symptoms that are indistinguishable from classic symptoms of malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and bacterial infections, all of which have been long common in Africa and preceded the era of AIDS. If I or you or an African present the following symptoms to a public health officer or to a doctor, you will be said to have AIDS. And those clinical symptoms are a persistent fever, loose stools or diarrhea for 14 days, a persistent cough, and a 10% loss of your body weight over the last 2 months. If you have those symptoms, and you are in Rwanda or Tanzania or South Africa or Ethiopia, you have AIDS. That's exactly what you have. And that's a very, very frightening conclusion to be told. And so that's what we need to count, are these cases of AIDS. So if someone says, don't you think there's AIDS in Africa? I simply reply, of course there's AIDS in Africa. If by the definition of AIDS you mean those clinical symptoms, I suppose there's been AIDS in Africa for 100 years or more, because those are the classic symptoms of poverty and underdevelopment. But they've simply been given a new name in the last 25 years, and futile efforts have been made to get people to change their behavior or to use condoms when having sex, and they imagine that that's going to have some effect on a cough or a fever or a loss of body weight or diarrhea. And I think you don't have to have a Nobel Prize or an MD or a Ph.D. to know that that's absurd. And that's what's the case primarily in South Africa as well.
Talk about the politics in South Africa and what Mbeki, the former president of South Africa, was faced with when he at least was open to re-examining the questions about how to treat AIDS, and how Bill Clinton, and an unusual move that bypassed most people's observation, declared that HIV was a national security issue and therefore made it a national security project. And that was brought into Africa as well. Give us that understanding.
Well, I certainly would have loved to have been present, a fly on the wall, if you will, when Mbeki and Clinton talked about AIDS, because from what I know about Thabo Mbeki, I think it would have been, the intellectual equivalent of a drive-by shooting or something like that. I think Clinton would have been way out of his element when talking about HIV and AIDS in Africa, which, was what made Thabo Mbeki so impressive to me as a scholar, and what made him so dangerous to the AIDS orthodoxy. He essentially was asking them to, belly up to the bar and answer the kind of questions you've been posing for decades, and a number of us have been posing as well. So I think what Clinton tried to do, or tried to suggest, was that